My name's Randall W. Richardson. I'm 68 years old, soon to be 69. Live in Oriana, Illinois.
And when and where did you serve in the military?
Uh, well, I served through basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, advanced individual training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, Officers Candidate School, Fort Benning, Georgia. Stayed at Fort Benning, Georgia as a TAC officer for about 10 months. Then I served with the 101st Airborne Division in the Republic of South Vietnam.
And what years were you serving?
I entered the service in February of 1969 and was discharged from the service in October of 1971.
All right, and then let's just start a little before you went off to war. So just like, where did you go to college?
Well, I grew up in Champaign, Illinois, and had intended to go to the University of Illinois, but I didn't get in. I didn't apply soon enough. Ended up at Eastern Illinois University with the thought of transferring back to the University of Illinois, but I liked it too much at Eastern, so I stayed there.
And then what were your feelings towards Vietnam while you were in college?
Well, of course, we would hear the 5 o'clock news, report of casualties and so forth, but we were young men and we were definitely involved in a campus life, so we didn't think too much about it. I was in a fraternity, and we did have some fraternity brothers who ended up in Vietnam while we were still in college. In fact, I had one fellow that was older than I was who graduated and went into the U.S. Marine Corps as a pilot and was killed in Vietnam while we were still in college.
How did that change your outlook as a college student before being in the military?
Well, I think the people that I associated with at the university were of the patriotic sort, and we all felt really terrible, of course, about our brother who had died in Vietnam. It was probably beginning to dawn on us. There were returning veterans who hadn't gone to college, but were now going to college after getting out of the service. So there were a number of Vietnam veterans that we would intermingle with, and I can remember one fellow he was always nervous and anxious, and of course I would run into him in the bars, and he would most often be under the influence. But it's like a loud noise, and you'd think he would think that we were getting bombarded or something. So we were getting a taste of what had happened to people who'd gone to Vietnam, and I guess we weren't thinking too far into the future. Otherwise, we would have been sort of worried about ourselves having to serve, which a lot of us did then after that.
Did your feelings towards the war change once you were actually in the war?
No, my feelings didn't. I allowed myself to, I allowed myself to serve my country, and I thought in my mind that what we were doing was the right thing to do. The South Vietnamese were not invading the North were invading the South. The South Vietnamese was not exactly a democratic country, but they had more freedoms and were more prone towards capitalism than the North.
Did you witness any protests while you were in college?
Only on TV. I don't think we had any protests at Eastern.
All right. So tell me a little bit about how you were drafted, when you learned you were drafted.
Well, I had a student deferment all through college. So I graduated from high school in '64, graduated from college in '68. As soon as I graduated, when at the ceremonies there at the university, my mother handed me the letter that said I had to report for physical, and then that got the ball rolling. I debated. I had the option at that point in time to enlist if I wanted to. I could have enlisted in the Navy, the Air Force, or the Marines, and I looked into all of those and decided there was a program called you could volunteer for the draft, which gave you the opportunity to go to Officers Candidate School. And so I in my mind, I thought, if I'm going to be in Vietnam, I'm going to be in the jungle. I'd like to have some sense of control. I'd like to be an officer. I'd rather lead men than have some dummy lead me into a catastrophe. So I chose that route. And so instead of a 2-year commitment, I had basically a 3-year commitment. It's 2 full years after I graduated from OCS.
What was like going through your mind when you got that letter the day of your graduation?
Holy cow, what's going to happen now? It was inevitable that it was going to happen, and just had to go with the flow.
What were your feelings about the draft then?
Well, I thought it was a natural thing. I guess I had not ever experienced life that when there wasn't a draft. There was a draft even during peacetime. So I didn't think too much about it. It was something young men my age were going to have to deal with.
Now, 40 years later, has your opinions about the draft changed?
I think having an all-volunteer army is fine. We seem to be able to find enough smart young men who are willing to serve their country, and they will volunteer, men and women. But in some respects, I think the draft would be good to bring back. I feel that young people should do something to serve their country, whether it be the military or whether it be Peace Corps or some other form of service, so that they would have a buy-in to what this country is all about.
Do you have any family that have also been veterans then, if you think?
I had numerous cousins, 2 of them at my age. Both of them served in the Navy. I had some older cousins who were of the Korean War age. One served in the Marine Corps and one served in the Army. The one that served in the Army was a Green Beret, and he had 3 tours in Vietnam.
And then also, you said that you think kids these days should serve their country in some way, like that they get some things. Like, what did you get out of serving your country that you think kids who don't end up going to serving don't get? Like, what do you have that they don't?
Well, I have a sense of having served that there was a purpose. I did something for the country. I think people who don't serve don't understand that everything in this world's not free. Everybody should serve their country and give back something. Now, of course, there are other ways you could do that besides serving in the military or the Peace Corps. I guess you could dedicate yourself to your church or to your community and give back that way. But
how does knowing you served and like having that pride, how has that like affected the way you live your life post-war?
Well, I don't know that it. I gained a lot from being in the military: discipline, dedication, goals, reaching for your goals, and trying to accomplish the mission. Things that may have been already a part of my character, but it was certainly emphasized while I was in the military.
So let's get back to military. What was your official role, and kind of can you explain that to someone who isn't in the military?
While I served in Vietnam? Well, it goes back to the organization of the Army, which we talked about previously, and if you've never been in the military, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. But while I was in Vietnam, I was an infantry platoon leader, which meant that I was in charge of my platoon, which was approximately anywhere from 17 to 25 men. I had a platoon sergeant who would have been an enlisted man who was a E6, and then I would have 2 squad leaders. That would be the leadership component of a platoon. So I would take orders from the company commander, who was normally a captain. On a daily basis, we would huddle up and we would be given our marching orders. And what generally happened was we were given a grid coordinate that we were to pass through the jungle to that point and search and destroy while we're on that march. So it was my job to lead the men and to try to keep them out of harm's way, to enforce discipline, and just basically guide them.
What was it like going on those marches?
We operated west of Hue, which was a mountainous area. For fear of running into booby traps, we didn't travel on trails or roads or waterways. What we basically did, would have our point man carry a machete, and we would basically break brush as we were headed towards our grid coordinates that we were given. So it was a lot of single file marching, spread out 5 to 10 yards apart, so that if we were ambushed, they wouldn't be able to get all of us. And we would travel almost always in daytime, and at night we would, just before dawn, we'd find a position that would be a place that we could defend. And just after dark, we would move into what we would call a night defensive perimeter. And then we would set up our perimeter, would dig foxholes. And then, as platoon leader, I would get on the radio and contact our nearest fire base that would support us with artillery fire. And I would give them our coordinates of where we were located and ask them to fire artillery rounds near our position. And we would call those night defensive targets. The object was, if you were hit at night and you needed artillery support, you would already have these night defensive targets registered with the guns. So we could call in and say, we need artillery on defensive target 2 or 5, or whatever number we would give it. So that was a routine and a ritual that I did every night whenever we would set up in the field.
And just describe for me walking through the jungle, what did it smell like what did it feel like what was going through your mind? Just kind of walk me through that.
Well, as I mentioned before, Vietnam was not to lessen the idea that it was very dangerous, but it was a lot of hard work. You're carrying everything you need for your nourishment, water, sea rations, an extra pair of socks, maybe a light jacket or something, some bedroll, and extra ammunition, that not only for your own weapon, but a lot of times people would have to carry machine gun ammo or extra batteries for the radio. So our load bearing was anywhere from 70 to 90 pounds. So you got a steel pot on, you got 70, 80, 90 pounds on your back, you got your weapon, and you're following the guy in front of you. And I always had a radio telephone operator right by me in case we need to communicate with our other platoons or the company commander. And so we're trying to be stealthy, but you're not really stealthy, because your point man up there is chopping weed, chopping bamboo, trying to make a way through the jungle, and you have vines that would catch on your rucksack, and so you're kind of struggling through there, and all the time you're keeping your eyes peeled, trying to protect yourself.
Did you ever run on any of these walks, encounter the Viet Cong?
We did. Backing up a little bit for the story, there's 3 platoons to a company. Company commander would say, Platoon A, Alpha Company, or First Platoon, you take this azimuth and go 1,000 meters that way. Second Platoon, you take this azimuth to those grid coordinates and you go that way. And the Third Platoon. So we were covering a fairly wide area and then we would just sweep through an area. This particular day, our 3rd platoon came upon a stream, and there were women and children, maybe 15, 18, and old men swimming in a stream bed. Turned out that they were Montagnards. They were unarmed. They were friendly to the Americans. Here they are, though. We encountered them in a free fire zone, meaning if you're not wearing an American uniform, you're free game. But luckily, the platoon leader realized they were unarmed, but they were in this free fire zone. So they basically helicoptered the Montagnards out, and I don't know where they took them. But we heard about this over the radio. As we were getting ready to set up our night defensive position by a stream that very same day and night, our security people close to the stream saw 4 black pajama-clad Vietnamese with sacks on their backs, and I was alerted, came up there, and we saw them walking away from us. And I didn't see any weapons. So, and I had a whole squad of men with me. We all had our weapons pointed at the Vietnamese. And so I said, "Chu hoi," which in Vietnamese means surrender, surrender. And they kind of looked back and took off running. And when they did that, then I said, "Open fire." And we shot at them. We must not have been very good shots because none of them fell. But it was very possible that we could have wounded them. But it was starting to get dark. And so we swept along both banks of the stream and down the middle of the stream for about 200 yards and didn't see anything. Came back, got in our night defensive perimeter. The next day I took a reinforced squad, which basically added two men to a regular squad. And that gave us 2 machine guns. And we walked where we had last seen the Vietnamese down that stream. And as we're walking down that stream, the point man runs into 2 Vietnamese, pajama-clad, armed, and he was able to kill them before they were able to get a shot off. Turned out we thought maybe they were a medical team, perhaps, because one of them was a woman. And she was armed, so, I mean, she was a legal combatant. The other guy had a grenade in his hand, which he never got a chance to throw because our point man killed him too quick. So that was one of the times.
Making that call to open fire, what was it like having to make a call like that?
It was easy. It was no problem, mentally or anything. You got to realize we're trained killers. I mean, that's what they trained us for, to kill people. That's what you do in war. And so I gave them fair warning. They could have put their hands up, stopped right then and there. I wouldn't have shot them. And as an anecdote to that story, after we got back, the battalion XO and the company commander said, "Don't ever do that. Shoot first, ask questions later." He's chewing me out because I didn't shoot first. So that's the way the hierarchy thought about things.
And then when you were talking about going through the jungle, you mentioned booby traps. Did you ever come across the booby traps?
We did. And we were patrolling an area where we had found some old bunkers that were unoccupied. And so it was an area where there had been a lot of enemy activity. And while we were patrolling, our Kit Carson Scout, who was a North Vietnamese who was captured and then pledged his loyalty to the South, they would put a Kit Carson Scout with each platoon if they had enough of them, because they would know, if you could believe in them and trust them, they would know what to look for in terms of booby traps and or signs of enemy activity, so they could be a valuable resource. Well, on this particular patrol, instead of staying in line and following the man next to him, he cut across. And we're not on a trail, but he cuts across, and there is an old trail there, and he trips a 60 millimeter mortar round that's been set up as a booby trap, and hit him and three other of my men. And of course, we had to call in medevacs and medevac them out.
What were the extent of those injuries?
My three men had some shrapnel wounds. None of them real serious, I don't think. But the Kit Carson Scout, he was in pretty bad shape. It was a belly wound, and his intestines were out, and so I don't know to this day whether he made it or not. I know he was alive when we got him on the chopper and got him out of there.
After having that experience with the booby trap, how did that affect your mindset going on these marches and the days following?
Well, looking for booby traps and avoiding booby traps was one of the major things that we did, and that's one of the major emphasis that I did put with my people. That's why we never walk trails, because if you're walking trails, you're just asking for it. You might get lucky, there might not be any booby traps, but that's a chance you just don't want to take. So our whole thing was, you don't walk trails, you break jungle, and that's the way we operated. It didn't affect me at all, really, because we always tried to avoid that, and we wrote that experience off to the Kit Carson Scout, not staying in line and following the man in front of him.
So you said you were constantly almost, was it a fear of these booby traps that was in, or was it just part of your...
Part of our training, that's it, and our protocol. That's just what you did.
All right, and then we talked a little about this before. Can you just briefly, for someone who doesn't know, describe fragging for me?
In Vietnam, it meant that somebody was throwing a hand grenade at a friendly, at another American soldier, for whatever reason. Enlisted men sometimes did that to officers they didn't like. Sometimes there were racial tensions back on the main fire bases, where our division was located. There were a lot of racial tensions. Malingerers and people on sick call, hanging around in the back area. There was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of racial tension, and so there were several fragging incidents while I was there that I heard about.
Did you have any direct experience with fragging, seeing it other than just hearing it?
Within the first month that I was with my platoon out in the field, we had been pulled back onto a fire base, and we were providing perimeter defense. And so we had bunkers, and 3 or 4 men to a bunker. And so I had a dopp kit. One morning I woke up, got my dopp kit. I was going to find some water and shave, and found a grenade in my dopp kit. And then I'm thinking, holy crap, what the hell's going on here? Anyway, I went outside and threw the grenade over into the jungle, and got down, and it didn't go off. It was a dud. Went back to my dopp kit, and there somebody had written a little note that said, "Next time, Mother, it'll be live," or something like that. So there was a threat on my life right there, a warning. And we had a CID investigation, but they never did determine who put it in there. And I didn't have any other problems after that.
Do you have any idea why someone would have put that in your dopp kit?
There's a there's a natural division, or there's an imposed division between officers and enlisted men. It's kept that way. You don't want to be too buddy with your men, because you have to give orders and make your men perform and help accomplish the mission. And so there are times when you got to give some tough orders. So there's always this division between the enlisted men and the officers. So that could have been a part of it, that just natural resentment of an officer, or the fact that I was a newbie in country, and I don't know, trying to scare me to do something. I don't know what.
Did it scare you, or did it have like?
Well, yeah, it scared me. I mean, I got the enemy that I've got to contend with. Now I got to worry about somebody on my own side that's possibly going to do me harm. So yeah, it did for a while. Wished I had eyes in the back of my head.
Why do you think bragging in general was like an issue in the Vietnam War?
Well, as the war wore on and there were more protests in the United States, you're talking about draftees, people who didn't want to be there, and people who developed an attitude that we shouldn't be there. Why do I have to go? Look at all the people back in the states that are protesting. I think it would be these draftees who didn't want to be there, who basically would describe themselves as peaceniks. You know, they would be the ones who would draw the peace sign on their helmet liner or helmet cover, or wear beads or whatever. So if they ran into, let's say, a West Point officer, who are notoriously gung-ho, they are out to earn a reputation. They're making the military a career. They want to distinguish themselves. If a draftee who had a bad attitude about being there, and you had one of those gung-ho West Pointers, it wouldn't have to be a West Pointer, but as an example, that would create a little environment where some private would build up his courage to try to do something to intimidate the officer, so that maybe he'd go easier on the men or something. I don't know really what their purpose would be, but that's a possible explanation.
What did you think of those men who were there and kind of would describe themselves as the peaceniks?
It depended on the individual. I mean, if he did his job, I thought that was fine. I mean, he could pretend he's a peacenik if he wants to, but as long as he did his job and obeyed orders and didn't malinger, and so I had no problem with that.
And then before, you had mentioned the racial tension. Did you experience any of that firsthand or witness any?
Not in the field. I had a black platoon sergeant. He was on his second tour. He's very knowledgeable, very experienced. I relied on him a lot. We only had maybe 3 or 4 black soldiers in my unit in the field, so there wasn't any really racial tension out in the field. It's in the rear where there was trouble, and there were drugs, and so part of it was drugs, part of it was just the black-white issue. Well, probably wouldn't have been any different than if you take a group of people in the United States and put them together. I mean, at that time.
Is there like any experiences with that racial tension or the drugs that like sticks out to you that you like saw, or like any problems?
Well, cocaine was fairly prevalent, and marijuana. And the reason I know cocaine, because you would see vials that the cocaine would come in small doses. You would see vials laying around on the ground in some places. No, I didn't see any people taking cocaine. I didn't run into anybody who who I thought was on cocaine. I did hear about, a near race riot where the S1, who was a captain, had to pull his .45 and shoot it in the air to stop some potential fights going on.
What did you believe you were like fighting for in Vietnam?
Well, the stated purpose of what the military said we were there for. That's what I believed. I believe that's what we were there for. We were to protect the South Vietnamese from the North Vietnamese.
Has that opinion changed at all?
No.
Then why do you think others felt differently than you and the stated goal?
Well, just a difference of opinion, I guess. People, of course, I heard the argument that Ho Chi Minh was just trying to reunite his country because it had been divided at the end of World War II, and he just wanted to reunite his country. Well, to me, it wasn't any different than the North Koreans wanting to reunite their country with the South Koreans. To me, that was the same issue. One was supported by communism and other communist countries, and that same thing in Vietnam, Russia, Cuban advisors, Chinese, they were all supplying the North.
And then what was your opinion of how the war ended?
Terrible. The North Vietnamese agreed to the terms of the truce, which was negotiated over however many years on how many secret trips by Henry Kissinger, etc. But had Congress not withheld funding for the South Vietnamese after we were all pulled out, I don't know if the South Vietnamese still would have been able to prevail and prevent the North from conquering them, but they would have had a heck of a lot better chance. And the fact that we didn't fund them for repair parts for the helicopters and tanks, vehicles, all that funding was cut off. So what are you going to do? If you lose your ally and the funding source for your weaponry, you don't stand much of a chance when the other side's being fully funded by the Chinese and the Russians.
What would you have liked to have seen done differently?
That I wish we'd have still funded them, and that we would have kept some skeletal force there, to which we did have, I think, because I remember all the Americans scrambling off the roof of the embassy at the last minute. But I don't know how many people we had out in the field supporting the South Vietnamese. But that would have been a good thing if we could have afforded to do that.
Was that your opinion immediately, like while the war was going on as well?
Well, I actually like Nixon's idea of Vietnamization. Train them up, give them the weapons, teach them how to fight, and let them do the fighting, and we'll be their reserve. We'll watch their back. I like that whole concept. That was a good way, I thought, of winding down America's involvement. So I think if we could have just continued to support them, let them do the fighting, the South probably would have prevailed. We would have had a demarcation there just like we do in Korea.
Has this opinion developed at all over the years, or was that your opinion then and like pretty much stayed stagnant?
It's pretty much stayed the same. I've heard all the arguments about, it was just a revolution within, amongst their own people. But how can you say that when you got Chinese and the Russians support the North? I mean, if I don't know how you could say it was a revolution and just trying to reunite the country. To me, it was a spread of communism. And you look back on, look at the countries where we did prevent the communists from taking over. South Korea. How's that compared to how Vietnam is now? South Korea is like an economic wonder. Free society, a capitalistic system economically. They're doing great. And Taiwan, same thing.
What was your impression of like the Vietnamese before the war? If you had any.
I didn't have any. I couldn't have told you where Vietnam was before the war.
What was your impression of them while you were there?
I did not have a lot of interaction with the Vietnamese. You'd run into them if you got to the PX. I really wasn't. I didn't go to Saigon. I didn't get into any villages. Come across some what we called Coke kids whenever we would get resupplied close by a village. So I guess I really didn't have much of an opinion about the Vietnamese. They just weren't. I wasn't around them that much.
Who were the Coke kids?
I have a picture I can show you later on. They're like little ragamuffins who follow American units around and try to beg for things, candy, or sell Cokes to them. That's why they got the name Coke Kids. They would try to sell Cokes to the troops if they ever ran into them.
Do you know any Vietnamese today in America?
I've met some, but not very many.
Do you think how has being in the Vietnam War changed that interaction?
Would I talk to them? Would I befriend them? Yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I think over the years you get over some things.
What were those things you had to get over?
Well, if you generically say Vietnamese, I mean, you could say, well, that could have been a North Vietnamese. So, getting over who your enemy was. Just like Americans had to get over what they thought about the Japanese, what they thought about the Germans. Over time, they're your enemy, but now they're not your enemy, so you get over it.
Well, I guess, did you have much interaction with the Scout kids?
The Kit Carson Scouts?
Carson, yeah.
Well, yeah, they were. You couldn't communicate very well with them unless they knew some English or you knew some Vietnamese, which I didn't. I mean, the slang words, about all I knew. Sometimes they could communicate with you, but a lot of times you had to do it with hand signals, or maybe they understood some English but couldn't speak it. But they were okay.
And then just during your time in Vietnam, is there one story or one day that when you think of Vietnam that just sticks out in memory?
Yeah, leaving Cam Bay, get on the airplane to go home. That sticks out. No one particular day. They all kind of run together. I look at pictures and it reminds me of what we were doing then. Reminds me of the people that I was serving with. And since we've been having these gatherings of the Alpha Company gatherings, I've gone to 4 of them now. I've re-established relationship with about 8 or 9 men that I served with in Vietnam, which is a real cool thing. Getting together, and it's been over 40 years, and to sit around and somebody will bring up, well, do you remember this, LT, when we were looking for these helicopters that were down, and when somebody else would chime in, yeah, I remember that, and do you remember that one guy that nobody could remember his name? Everybody tells a different version of the story. We're old men now. We can't remember because of crap back then. So it's still fun to get together with the troops that you served with.
Can you describe for me what it felt like to get on that plane to go home and kind of just like walk me through that?
Well, you're like a herd of cattle. The Army is like that. I mean, they herd you around. You go get in this line to get this paperwork done. You go over there, get that paperwork done. Chow time, getting in line to go through chow. So you had to go all through these procedures to get your paperwork straight. And then they made you give a urine specimen to make sure you weren't on marijuana or some other drug. And if you had marijuana in your urine, you didn't get on the bird to go home. You had to wait until you could give a urine specimen that did not include drugs. So they you got a duffel bag of all your earthly belongings that you're taking home with you. It has to be inspected, so they put it up on a kind of an assembly line, tear it apart, and look for whatever drug mainly. And then once they've inspected that, you go on through and walk out on the tarmac and climb the stairs, get on the airplane, big old smile on your face, thinking, I made it. And you really didn't say that until the plane was off the ground and about 20,000 feet in the air. Then everybody hoops and hollers and say, we made it.
What was it just like, kind of like how describe like the atmosphere on that plane?
Well, believe it or not, you could still smoke on the airplane at that time. People were smoking and drinking, joking. Some people were just sleeping. It was about a 17-hour flight, all total. But just everybody maybe daydreaming their own daydreams about what it'll be like to get home. What will they be doing with their future? Thinking about things like that. Maybe reminiscing about some buddies they've left behind. But mostly very happy.
And what was it like when that plane landed? What was going through your mind?
Same thing. When I got back, I was out of the Army. All I had to do was process out. A lot of enlisted men still had to serve an extra 6 months. Their 2 years total wasn't up, so they would have to go to a post, which I think was a very bad thing for a lot of Vietnam veterans being put back in a peacetime situation. But I got out because they had a big reduction in force. They didn't need as many officers that they had, so that's why my tour was shortened, and when I got back to the States, I got out. I was at Fort Lewis, Washington. Well, you land on the airport, there's no bands playing, none of your relatives are there. So you're at a out processing military installation. So had a debriefing, had a medical examination, basically to determine if I had any wounds or disabilities that I was going to claim. I didn't, so it was a one-day process. The next day you got tickets to wherever your home location was, and mine was to fly back to O'Hare. And that's where when I got off the plane there, that's where my family was. That was a great feeling.
Who was waiting for you in O'Hare?
My wife, my 2-year-old daughter, my mother and father, and my in-laws, and my brothers and sisters. The whole clan was there.
What was it like when you landed? What was just describe for me the event?
Well, it would be like if you hadn't seen a relative for a long, long time, and you got off the airport and they met you at the airport. It'd be like that.
Who were you most? Might be hard to say. Was there someone what were you most excited to go home for?
My wife and my child.
When did you two meet and get married?
We met in college, right at the end when I was graduating. She was a year or two younger. And I thought We had dated, but not for very long. But somehow the relationship continued after I graduated, and she was still in school, and then I went to the Army, and the relationship continued on, and we decided to get married. Got married right before I started OCS.
What was it like having to leave a wife behind going to war, and how do you think it was different than, say, some of the other soldiers who didn't have their own family back home?
Well, the difference obviously would be, as a single enlisted man or a single officer even, you're more carefree. You're not deluged with thoughts of loved ones or anything. You're just watching out for number one. Of course, you might be thinking about your parents, but if you're not married, you're not obviously thinking about a wife. Just a more carefree, I'll take care of myself and let me just get through this attitude. Whereas I think somebody who was married would be a little more cautious, would be somewhat distracted at times by thoughts of loved ones at home, but not a big difference probably.
How often did you get to communicate with your wife at all?
Letters. One time I was able to get to a what they called a Mars phone. I forget what that stands for, but basically it was like a telephone that was relayed through ham operators. So you'd tell them who you wanted to talk to, what the phone number was. Somebody closest to your home would be a relay from them to another ham operator somewhere else in the world. Anyway, you would talk and say what you had to say, and then you'd say over. So then that would be relayed through these ham operators, and then they could say, like if I was talking to my wife could say what she wanted to say, and then she'd have to say over to know that her side of the conversation was over, and that's how it went back and forth. That was the only time I got to talk to anybody, was that one time.
Were you able to write letters or anything?
Yeah, we wrote letters. That was the main communication.
What was it like getting those letters in the field?
Oh, it was great. Just hearing from home, getting caught up with what they're doing, and just hearing from them. It was great.
How do you think, how did you being away almost immediately after you got married, do you think had any effect on your relationship?
Well, we didn't really know each other that well. And then you get married and then you're separated. You don't find out what it's like to really be married to someone until you've spent some time with them. So when I graduated from OCS, then I had almost a year with my wife before I had to go to Vietnam. So it was a maturing and growing experience. One thing that was real sad for me was when I stepped off that plane in O'Hare, my wife has my daughter in her arms, and she says, "There's Daddy, there's Daddy." And she didn't know me. And she wouldn't come to me. That kind of broke my heart.
How old was your daughter when you left?
She was just over a year. Over a year old.
How do you think leaving, besides just having a wife over there, also having a child, how do you think that was different? Changing your mindset while in Vietnam?
Only that, you just hoped and prayed that you made it through and that you'd be able to get back to them.
So we were talking about your daughter. How old is she now?
45. I figured that out.
Again, just remember kind of the answer includes sentences thing, so that people know what you're talking about. So again, how old is she now?
My daughter is 45.
Do you have any other kids?
I have a son who is 43.
And just kind of like, do you have any grandkids or anything?
I have 3 grandchildren with one more on the way. My daughter has 2 sons, one 17 and one soon to be 13. And my son didn't get married right away, and he has a small child that is 2 years old. Another child that is due in July.
Do you think being a veteran affected you as a father at all, or like helped or anything?
I think my military training, I somehow sort of passed that on to my kids in a way. Well, at least they experienced having a father who had been a military officer. I think they would tell you that. Security was always something I preached to my children. And they like to laugh at an incident that happened. We were in Chicago watching the Chicago Bears, and we bought programs and I think some types of souvenirs. And we found our seats, and they wanted to go get some refreshments, so they left them there and went. And when they came back, they were gone. Somebody had stolen them. And so I really raving mad over that incident. And so they remember that as just an example of, I really lectured them about, you never leave your stuff unguarded. You always have to think about security.
What was it about security in the war that kind of like transcended, like, why was that so important to you?
Well, if you weren't security conscious, that left you open to getting killed. I mean, you're not in a war zone, unaware of your circumstances, and you're always on guard. Not walking out in the open, always wearing your steel pot in case you get shot. You want to have that steel pot. You just had to be security conscious. That's the whole thing about keeping yourself alive, keeping your men alive when you're in a combat zone.
Do you do anything you think different than non-veterans security-wise now?
I've kind of gotten over that a little bit. In the early days when I got back from Vietnam, say the first 20 years after I was back, I was very security conscious, always worried about burglars, somebody breaking into your car. So I would always make sure the car was locked, make sure the front and back doors were locked, windows were secure. I was very conscious about that. And I know I passed that on to my son. I last visited my son in Phoenix, that's where he lives. He has deadbolts on all of his doors and regular locks. And staying all night at his house, get up in the morning, you can't get out of his house unless you have a key to undo the deadbolts. And so he lives in a good part of town, but he's very security conscious. And I think that's probably something he got from me.
Is there anything else? Because you kind of laughed when you said they would both say that they definitely were raised by like a military officer dad. Why would they say that? Like, what?
I was a pretty stiff disciplinarian. I would often use military slang in a non-confrontational way, just to carry over from my experiences. So it just little things that they would pick up that would let them know that that their father had been in the military.
And then you talked about coming home and like making sure your doors were always locked. What was it like transitioning from being in the jungle to coming back to Illinois?
I went on R&R. Let's see, I got there in January. I went on R&R in August. Went to Hawaii, met my wife in Hawaii. Coming out of the jungle and going to Hawaii was a gargantuan shock, cultural shock. Being in a war zone, being always on guard, out in the jungle, dirty, and then being in paradise for 5 or 6 days. You realized a lot of Americans don't even know there's a war going on. They're living their lives, enjoying life, the finer things, and here we are drinking water out of a canteen and walking in the mud in the jungle, and the fear of running into the enemy, etc. Just two different worlds. So what I experienced in Hawaii was kind of a lessened the shock or the change that you experience going back to the United States, but it was the same sort of thing.
What is R&R?
I think it stood for rest and recuperation. And when you served in Vietnam, you were given one out-of-country R&R. Some people actually came back to the United States. A lot of married men went to Hawaii. A lot of single men went to Sydney, Australia, or Hong Kong, or Thailand.
And then, what do you think was like the hardest part about coming back and like getting used to regular American life?
The hardest part was finding a job. If you had a job waiting for you, that was fine, but if you didn't, you had to find one. And being married with a child, I needed to find one right away. Answered an ad in the paper, went in for the interview, got the job, making less than I was when I was in the Army, with combat pay and everything, making less than a teacher was making. So once you had a job, then we had some money saved from my combat pay in Vietnam. We couldn't afford to rent a house or an apartment in Champaign. Ended up renting a duplex unit in St. Joe, which is a little town east of here. We had enough money saved, we were able to buy some furniture. So we got by. It was a struggle until you got yourself established.
Do you think being a veteran made it harder to find a job?
No, I don't think so. I think it was a matter of what you were qualified for, a matter of where you lived. There were jobs, but you had to find them. There was some recruiting companies out of Atlanta, Georgia, who were put out feelers, I guess, all over the country. Said, come to Atlanta. We'll find you a job if you were an officer in the service. They were looking for people like me. The only problem was they wouldn't pay you to come down there. They wouldn't pay your expenses to come down there. They wouldn't pay for your hotel room once you were there or your meals. You were just there to be in an environment where there were probably a lot of employment opportunities for veteran officers. Didn't go, couldn't afford it. My mother, I was sitting at a bar one time with my dad, telling him I might go to Atlanta. He says, "Oh, your mother really wouldn't like that." And that actually played a part in my decision not to do that.
Why didn't your mom want you to go to Atlanta?
She wants her family all around her.
Did you have any siblings?
I had 2 sisters and a brother. Still do.
Did your brother serve in Vietnam?
No, he was too young.
Okay. Talk a little. We didn't really get into your training so much. Can you talk a little bit about your training and also like how it was different than just the average soldier?
I think we trained our soldiers really good, if they paid any attention at all, going through basic training or advanced individual training, they were well trained, and it would be a matter of attitude and self-survival or whatever, to pay attention and acquire all those skills they're teaching you. In addition to doing basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey. I did advanced individual training at Fort Leonard, Missouri. Went to OCS at Fort Benning, Georgia, and learned all the things over again that I learned in basic training and advanced individual training. So it was totally reinforced, and other stuff added onto that: tactics, leadership, the basics of artillery, calling in artillery, map reading, and the air mobile concept, which was a new thing in Vietnam. That's where they moved troops around by helicopter, and the logistics of moving companies or moving battalions by air mobile. It was a whole new concept. So you had to sort of learn how to do that, how to organize that and coordinate that.
What is OCS?
Officers Candidate School.
And like, how long was that, and kind of like, how was that different than basic training?
Well, the whole purpose of Officer Candidate School is to train people to be officers. So you come out of the enlisted ranks while you're going through basic training and the other AIT. You're basically learning how to familiarization with all the weapons you're going to be using, the hand grenades, getting used to the uniform. Officers Candidate School is you're there to become an officer, to learn everything that entails.
Is there anything you think, how do you think you were more prepared compared to someone who didn't have OCS?
Well, I was better trained because I had 6 more months of training. A lot of people who went through basic training and did their advanced individual training, mostly at Fort Polk or Fort Ord, California. Those were the 2 main infantry advanced individual training centers. A person right out of high school that got drafted, 18 years old, 19 years old, got drafted, went to basic training, went to advanced individual training, most likely got orders for Vietnam right after that. So he had basically 16 weeks of training. He's on the bird to Vietnam.
Do you think that was enough training?
If you paid attention, it was. Yeah. If you took your training seriously, it was enough.
And then just kind of going back, earlier you had talked about how kind of everyone should serve. Have any of your children served?
No. My daughter's an accountant, and my son is in occupational health and safety.
Oh, and also we talked about this coming back. You always hear a lot of stories about like resentment or anything. Did you personally encounter anyone?
No one spit on me in the airport or disrespected my uniform. Wow, no.
Do you think that happened, or do you think that was just kind of like? Do you think it was where you were, the area you were? If it was just that was just more talk. Like, what is your opinion on that?
I think it happened. Oh yeah, I think it happened plenty of times. It didn't happen to me because, well, I guess it could have happened when I was getting on the airplane to fly from Fort Lewis, Washington to O'Hare, but I don't recall anybody paying any attention to me at all. Maybe I just wasn't looking. But then, of course, when I get to O'Hare, my whole family's there. Nobody's going to do anything to me with my whole family around. But I think it happened.
Did you tell people you were a veteran when you came home?
My prospective employer, I told, and like who?
I was just wondering, like, did you not really tell people, or were you open? Did you talk about what was your feeling about your veteran status when you came home?
I was proud of my veteran status. I would have told anybody who'd asked. I did not necessarily blast it out.
What is and then just how, we talked about how your view in the Vietnam War hasn't really changed. Your view in just war in general, how has that changed over the years? How do you think the Vietnam War affected that?
I think sometimes war is necessary, but I think the government who gets us into wars needs to fight a war to win. The massive power that we had in Vietnam could have wiped out the North very easily. We weren't allowed to. We did some bombing in North Korea or North Vietnam, but not enough. We could have kept on bombing them until they surrendered. If we would have been able to go into Cambodia and Thailand or Laos, where the resupply lines for the North Vietnamese were running, we weren't allowed to go in there. We did finally get to go into Cambodia, but that was just an excursion in and out. If we'd been able to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail or actually go into the Cambodia and Laos, that would have been an easy war to win. We were not allowed to win it. So if there's any future wars, I hope there aren't restrictions on our forces like that. And the rules of engagement, when you're trying to fight an enemy that's integrated itself into the civilian population and they're not wearing uniforms, in order to avoid innocent and civilian casualties, the rules of engagement are much to the detriment of our troops. Even in Afghanistan, where you'd be up in the mountains, you'd still run into villagers who might not be sympathetic to U.S. forces, but they might not be openly hostile either. But they might be hiding Taliban, Al-Qaeda, anybody that's our enemy that we're searching for. So it's hard to separate, friendly from foe. And that's a difficult environment to fight in. But the rules of engagement should give our troops the benefit of the doubt. They shouldn't be criminalized by accidents that happen.
Why don't you think, in your opinion, why weren't we allowed to win the war?
Talking about the Vietnam War, why weren't we? Well, there was a big fear of escalation of the war. If we were bombing North Vietnam, the big fear was that there would be a Russian or a Chinese ship, and we would accidentally or hit one of their ships, and then they might escalate and retaliate in some way. So there was a fear of widening the war beyond just the North and the South Vietnam. I guess we didn't bomb or allow troops into Laos or Cambodia because those were countries who wouldn't allow us to. I guess maybe that was it. Maybe their governments said, don't you be bringing troops in here, don't you be bombing in our country. So maybe they were sort of friendly to the Vietnamese for fear that the Vietnamese would then take over their countries.
And then you also mentioned civilian casualties. Did you have any personal experience with that?
With innocents and civilians? No.
And then you talk a lot about winning. What would you have defined as winning the war?
We pretty much had tamed and civilized the Viet Cong. Most people don't realize that the Tet Offensive of '68, that the Viet Cong, most of their troops and a lot of their structural forces were decimated. And if it weren't for the NVA, regular troops, the country would have been pretty well pacified. So if you didn't have NVA troops and the countryside is fairly well pacified with having decimated the Viet Cong, I think you could have called that victory.
And then all these opinions you have about the war, did you get them? Where do you think you got them from? Was it just physically being in the war? Was it the men above you? What led you to develop these opinions?
Well, from the political questions, why we were there and was it the right thing to do, that was just having been a college graduate, having I was a political science major, so I had a lot of reading and lectures on international affairs. So I had a good understanding, or at least I thought I did, of how we got there and why we were there. And I was the leading edge of the baby boomers. I was born in 1946. World War II was just over. There were lots and lots of American veterans around. There were lots and lots of war movies at the theater. So you would run into veterans. You would see movies about World War II. Definitely looked up to our American veterans who fought in World War II.
And then I just realized you talked about that first job you got in the newspaper. I'm not sure we ever got what specifically that job was.
It was financial services. It was a consumer finance company, a small loan company. They put me into a management training program, 9 months. I was given my own office, moved from Champaign to Danville, run my own office over there. Associates Financial Services was the name of the company. Then they transferred me to Decatur, and then I met somebody at the bank, at Milliken Bank, and they hired me to come over and do consumer loans at Milliken Bank.
And was there we talked about what you learned in the military kind of affected how you were as a dad. How did what you learned in the military affected how you performed at your job?
Having served in the military and having served in a combat zone, coming back to being a civilian, I had a lot of confidence in my abilities to do whatever I set out to do. Having survived that, had been in a leadership role, I didn't think there was any challenge too big that I couldn't conquer. I just had a lot of confidence having come through and experienced all that.
How are we looking on time, Tim?
About 9 after 11.
So I guess is there anything that we haven't covered, or like a story that like sticks out to you that you would want to share?
I had one fellow who was already there when I got to my platoon, and I heard a story about him. Every night we'd set up a night defensive perimeter. You would identify likely avenues of approach if you thought you were going to get hit. Mainly it would be easy terrain where they might walk into your night defensive perimeter. So we would identify those approaches and we'd put out mechanical ambushes, which was a claymore with a tripwire across the trail hooked to a battery. And if they tripped the wire, the battery would connect and the claymore would go off. You wouldn't have to sit there and detonate the claymore by hand. It would go off automatically. We set those out, probably 2 of them each night. And one of my troopers, I was told, would set out his claymore mechanical ambush, and then in the morning, first thing, daylight, go out and disassemble it and take it apart. I was told that he walked through and tripped his own mechanical ambush, not once, but twice, and it did go off. 2 things about that. One, to be so stupid not to remember where you set up your own mechanical ambush and you walk through it, that's bad. But the second thing, the fact that it didn't go off, meaning it was worthless, was the second bad thing. That was an incident that I remember.
Knowing that some of these like security precautions didn't always work, like what was it like going to sleep at night in that kind of environment?
Edgy. After a while, you could get to sleep, but it was always edgy. It was always uncomfortable. You know, you're on the ground. You know, always there's going to be a rock or a root or something that you're laying on, so you're not going to be able to get totally comfortable. And you always have your weapon close at hand. And so, mosquitoes, a lot of times you'd have to cover up your head just to get away from the mosquitoes. And then you'd have to pull guard duty. Everybody had to do a spell of guard duty before they couldn't. You didn't sleep the whole night through. If you had guard duty at first, okay, so you lost 2 hours or 3 hours there, and then you got to sleep the rest of the night, or you got woke up in the middle of the night and pulled 3 hours of guard duty during the middle of the night. That was one thing about Vietnam. You didn't get much sleep, especially when you were in the field. I probably got 5 hours on average sleep a night.
And what was it like, almost it sounds like you were, like, exhausted, is that accurate?
Yes, very accurate.
And then what was that like, just, like, going through something already so stressful, and, to where you have to be, like, so focused when also getting minimal sleep? Just kind of, like, describe that for someone.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Vietnam was hard work in a difficult terrain. You're basically on the equator, so you know how hot it is and how hot it can be. Humid. I mean, you could break a sweat with walking 10 feet. Carrying the loads that we carried and the fear of encountering the enemy, it all added up to a very, very stressful time, very, very hard time. So occasionally you'd take a break. You could see guys who weren't on guard duty sleeping. Catch sleep whenever you can.
Then can you tell me a little bit about some of the friendships you made over there? What that was like?
It's different for me as an officer. I was closest to one squad leader and was closest to two guys who were my radio telephone operator, RTO. But when we left Vietnam, we didn't stay in touch. So about 4 years ago, we started getting together, and so it was like 40 years we weren't in touch. So I wouldn't say that we had friendships. Now we do. They're friendships now. But immediately after the war, there weren't. And I couldn't, just because of that division I described between officers and enlisted men, you really couldn't be their friend. So I would say I did not have friends in Vietnam. I have friends now with the people that I served with, but it's only now.
What are those friendships like now, and like, what does it mean to you to like be friends with other Vietnam vets today?
It's a reassurance. It's a reliving of the past. It's a proud feeling to know that we served. Not everybody did. We did. We made it back. Not everybody did. So to be able to relive and retell stories with people who went through the same thing that you did, it's just it's a special feeling.